Hello everybody, my name is Christian and I use the pronouns she. I'm not a native speaker English, so forgive me if you sometimes hear strange constructions of the English language.
Deviations.
Deviations, yes, thank you Nick. Keep that in mind. I'm going to steer you through the first block, that's the block Institutional Research, and the first lecturer who will present is Michelle de Wit. Michelle, she uses the pronouns she, yes. Completed the Research Master Art Studies at the University of Amsterdam in 2017. And her project for the Deviant program is a continuation of her MA thesis, in which she focused on the presentation of Alexander Rodchenko's Gulag photomontages for the journal USSR in Construction in Dutch museums today. Michelle currently works as a freelance researcher and with a specific focus on art and politics. Michelle, you have 20 minutes. If you see me signing, then this means that you have to finish your...
Yes, so thank you for organizing this. I think it will be a wonderful conference and for allowing me to continue my research here at the vanabbemuseum. So today I will speak about the journal USSR in Construction, and I actually wanted to start my presentation with the words that opens the first issue of this magazine. And those words said, the State Publishing House has chosen the photo as a method to illustrate socialist construction, for the photo speaks much more convincingly than even the most brilliantly written article. Well, the journal itself, you can see one of its covers here, showed to a national as well as to an international audience the industrialization of the Soviet Union during the 1930s. Well, it was published between 1930 and 1941, as well as in 1949, and it was published in Russian, German, English, and French, and also in Spanish after 1938. And in 1949, the journal was no longer published in German. Well, the average print run per issue per year reached between 30,000 to 100,000 copies for the Russian edition, and then between 2,000 and 11,000 copies for the other languages. The journal could be both in selected bookstores in North and South America, as well as in the Middle East, in Asia and Eastern Europe, and in Western Europe. In the Soviet Union, the journal was mainly distributed amongst high-ranked party members. Two of the US subscribers of the journal may be interesting to point out, because those are JP Morgan as well as Edsel Ford. And Edsel Ford also wrote a letter to the editors of the journal in which he said, I was very interested by the photographs and information contained in your magazine. I will be glad if you will continue to send me the magazine, which provides us the possibility to be up to date on the progress of your construction program. So it's not completely a surprise that Ford was one of the subscribers to this journal, because in 1921 he had a $30 million contract with the Soviet Union on providing automobiles. And one of the writers, or editors actually, of USSR in Construction was the writer Maxim Gorky. He was one of the maybe best known editors and worked for the journal until he suddenly died in 1936. The magazine is actually best known today because of the artists that signed it, and those were John Hartfield, but also Alexander Rodchenko and Lesitsky. So what's very interesting about this magazine is that it's very quite modernist in its form, but Stalinist in its content. Well, the LS collection here at the vanabbemuseum, which was presented to the vanabbemuseum by Albert Lemmens and Serge Thomas, actually contains a very impressive collection of Russian artist books. Well, it actually contains all 121 issues of the magazine that were published before the Second World War, which is quite a rarity in the world, so that makes it very special to have all those issues here in Eindhoven. But they're also quite often on display, and this is actually where my journey begins. because when they are on display, they are often criticized. And you can see some of these critiques here. And these were on an exhibition in Foam, so the Photography Museum in Amsterdam, as well as on exhibitions held here at the vanabbemuseum and at the Museum de Fundatie in Zwolle, and also at an exhibition held at the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. Well, because exhibitions, especially in art museums, that show these issues, all over the world, got quite a lot of these critiques. Well, and the critics, almost always historians, criticized museum curators, almost always art historians, for their lack of historical context when exhibiting these issues of USSR in construction. Well, and even though the images were always historically contextualized during those more art historical exhibitions, this was not considered sufficient. Because I found it very striking that in many art historical studies on USSR and construction, the magazine is always almost described for its formal aesthetic quality, even though that's then usually historically contextualized, but you never really find an analysis that actually looks at how did these artists mediate ideology, or how did they work with the state, which is also quite a difficult task, of course, to dive into, but I find it always quite striking that that was so much missing. So in my research, I want to analyze the most notorious issue of USSR in construction, which was created by Alexander Radchenko, and which was about the construction of the White Sea-Baltic Canal, which was carried out by the Gulag. Well, this is also the issue that was most often singled out for criticism on the exhibitions. For example, actually the only critique in English is specifically on that issue. And in my analysis, I want to emphasize how Radchenko's constructivist ideals merged with the ideals behind this massive forced labor camp. I wanted to do that through what you can call a showing-seeing exercise, because I want to focus not just on what we see, but how we see what we see. So, just a very brief theory. I based that mainly on the work of W.J.T. Mitchell, because he, as well as other scholars as well, like Ariella Azoulay or Georges D. Uberman, foreground focus on power relations between photographer or artist, photograph subject, and then the viewer. And they also question the ethical position of the artist. And I think this really helps us to take, already known assumptions about a journal like USSR construction and look at them with fresh eyes. So here you can see some examples of USSR in construction. And I want to tell a little bit more about its visual language first, because the first issues of USSR in construction were actually not very visually exciting. They showed photographs of various construction sites that, according to Gorky, the editor, could just have well been taken by a bureaucrat. But this changed when John Hartfield was invited to design one of the issues in 1931. And here the focus shifted to one particular construction site instead of several, and Hartfield also used photomontage, which resulted in what quickly became known as the photo essay. Hartfield closely integrated text and image, which created a very cohesive narrative framework. This smoothly took the viewer through very spectacular sites of industrial transformation. But this montage approach of creating a visual narrative of transformation also had a much stronger ideological aim, which was absent in the earlier issues that just showed photographs of construction sites, because it not only showed the transformation of the landscape of old Russia into the new industrial Soviet Union, it also focused on how these socialist construction sites, through their work, turned backward peasants into politically aware industrial workers. For example, in the issue on Magnetostroi, it was said as follows: a new man makes his appearance on the arena of history. Socialist construction created this new man. After Hartfield, Lisitsky and Sophie Lisitsky-Kubers, always mentioned as SNL Lisitsky in the issues, started to design some of the issues. and they were later followed by Alexander Radchenko and Varvara Stepanova in 1933. Well, and I emphasize that they designed the issues because they didn't take the photographs themselves. That was done by other photographers at those particular sites. Well, there's actually one exception here, and that's the issue on the White Sea-Baltic Canal. Well, SNL Lisitsky, as well as Radchenko and Stepanova, managed to coincide in modernist experimentation with government dictates about industrialization and propaganda. This is one of the examples of 1935 about Soviet paratroopers, and what's actually interesting about the issue is that Radchenko literally makes you unfold the story. So as you can see, it's kind of on the top left, it's still unfolded, and then once you go through the story, kind of the whole page kind of collapses into this big parachute. So what's interesting is that he actually makes the viewer of the journal quite active in this way, in discovering that very spectacular story that, well, if you see the last page, probably didn't happen, but that wasn't really the issue of the journal itself. Well, here we find Alexander Radchenko, and Radchenko really saw himself not so much as an artist, but as an engineer of social life. Well, he claimed that through the use of photography, people could transform the way they saw the world. Well, his aim was to shape a viewer's consciousness, or as he said it, revolutionize their visual thinking. Well, he was called an engineer of the soul, and I think that's something very interesting to keep in mind once we go through the issues that he designed. Radchenko was a very versatile artist, and after 1921, his main concern was mass media and its effective communication. Radchenko was constantly rethinking his relation to and the use of mass media, and this position also put him in direct dialogue with the authorities. Well, and it's the notorious issue on the White Sea-Baltic Canal, and it also has a little map so you can actually see where it was located. Because the first issue Radchenko created for USSR in construction was the 12th issue of 1933, which was on the construction of this canal. Well, this would become the most notorious project during his entire career, and also the most gloomy issue out of all the issues of USSR in construction. Well, it was quite exceptional also because it was the only issue for which Radchenko took the photographs himself, and it was also the only issue he created without the help of Varvara Stepanova, and it was also the only issue in which he signed his photomontages. There's only one exception in him signing the photomontages, and that's the 7th issue of 1940 on Vladimir Mayakovsky, where he also signed one of the portraits of that futurist poet. But let's focus on this issue first, because what it shows us is that construction of the White Sea Canal, I hope it will be clear, is also known as Belomor. Now, where all issues of USSR in construction suppressed the knowledge of forced labor, this issue is the exception. It celebrated the use of forced labor as a progressive way of transforming the minds of criminals into true Soviet citizens. The construction of this canal was therefore carried out by the main administration of camps, better known by its acronym, the Gulag. As the historian Anne Applebaum has put it, Belomor was the first, last and only Gulag project that ever exposed to the full light of Soviet propaganda, both at home and abroad. The construction of the canal took 20 months, started in 1931, and the opening was on the 2nd of August 1933. There was no heavy machinery available. All tools were made by hand by the prisoners, except for a few drilling devices. The prisoners were not seen as humans, but as units of labor, which literally transformed them into the machinery. A working shift could last up to 24 hours, but during the summer months it wouldn't become dark. Food was very scarce. The landscape was composed mainly of granite. According to the official numbers of the secret numbers of the secret police, approximately 11,000 people lost their lives during the construction due to hunger, accidents, the cold, or just execution, while many more have disappeared. Radchenko visited Belomor 3 times for a total period of 3 months. He stayed with the highest camp commanders and also had his own dark room at the camp itself. And he took over 2,000 images, of which many are actually still unknown. The images were not only printed in USSR in construction, but also in a propaganda book. Let's see, this book was created by a collective of 36 writers, led by Maxim Gorky. And this book is also part of the LS collection and was also criticized in those exhibitions. Most of these pictures in the book are also taken by Radchenko. What's interesting is that also this book doesn't disguise the use of forced labor, not only in the Russian editions, but also not in the English editions. They actually open the book with it, because there they say, what happens to political prisoners in the USSR? Does a Soviet labor camp differ from a concentration camp in, say, Nazi Germany? The White Sea Canal tells the fate of the political prisoners. So this was printed in the English edition that came out, I think it was in 1935. What is of interest in relation to analyzing Radchenko's images is the way in which this book describes the transformation that the prisoners underwent. Because this process of transformation was called Velikovka. This term can best be translated into reforgement or even into rehammering. The word forge can be understood both as a noun and a verb, and it refers to the fire that melts the metal and the process of melting itself. The word has very strong industrial connotation, and it also tells us a bit more about the violence with which this transformation process was carried out. Radchenko took pictures of all the prisoners working, but also of the cultural activities that they had to carry out, because in their spare time, for example, they had to organize performances where they would reenact their own process of transformation. In this book, several stories of guards and high-placed secret police officers are included as well, which is quite interesting, actually. So the book also contains short interviews with prisoners where, of course, they tell about how lucky they are that they are given this chance to change their life for the better. What's also actually most interesting is the way the prisoners are referred to, because they are often called wreckers, saboteurs, enemies, or even units of labor. And specifically, the Ukrainian prisoners are called kulaks, or the kulaks, so-called middle-class peasants, were referred to as half animals, people not even worthy of the word animal. And what the book also tells us is that during the process of transformation, the prisoners became more human, and therefore the relation between the guards and the prisoners also became much more humane. This is also one of the images from the propaganda book. It's called Brass Band at the White Sea Canal. And I found this picture very interesting because one of the leading art historians on Radchenko's work, Alexander Laventjev, who's also his grandson, very specifically singled out this photo for the kind of the power structure between the prisoners and the one who took the photograph. But then often, as you see in the literature on Radchenko, that isn't really explained. And how do we see that? So therefore, I thought maybe it's interesting to go into this a little bit more, because here we can see very clearly that the workers themselves are located on the lowest level in the photograph. You can also see that indeed they don't really have any big tools. And then the other prisoners that are allowed to play musical instruments are placed on a slightly higher level, and then the photographer is placed on the level that kind of looks down upon them all. And I find it quite interesting because the prisoners were not allowed any humanity in that sense. And I find it very interesting that the photographer always positioned himself above them, so you're always looking down upon the prisoners in many of the images in the book. We also see that power structure actually. These are a few pictures actually from USSR and construction then, where you can see the transformation of the landscape, also some of the high-placed officers that were working at the camp. and also well, the use of music and culture also to really transform people's minds. And then the last image of USSR in construction, where Gorky speaks to the prisoners as them being human. Well, I've actually found the power structure between the prisoners and the guards most clear in this photomontage from USSR in construction. Because here on the left we are kind of looking over one of the locks, and we see the shadow of the photographer kind of in the lower right corner, and all the way opposite of us we see another man, but we can't really see who it is, and he has a small text underneath him. And then in the second photomontage we again see this little text and the van above it, but here we can see that this van is actually a guard holding a rifle. And the book also describes the use of rifles, because it says that the prisoners ask the guards to do so because they find themselves dangerous to society. But what I found very interesting here is that actually Rodchenko constantly places us on the same level as those guards. And he does that here quite literally, with the shadow, then in the first image and then in the second image. We kind of again place ourselves opposite of the guard standing on the other side, looking down with us on the prisoners that are going to work. Rodchenko also wrote about his work at the White Sea Canal, or actually he had to, because in 1936 he had to defend his own position as a Soviet artist, and therefore he used this model of selfhood that was presented at the White Sea Canal to also apply that on his own transformation of an artist from old Russia that changed into a new Soviet artist. Because this model of selfhood was not just limited to the prisoners. And we also can see that in the area after Stalin's death. And sometimes people say, well, indeed, I was sent to the Gulag because I did something wrong, but you see, I worked, I've bettered myself, and now I can return to society. But luckily, that wasn't done by all people. But I think it's very interesting because actually that model was quite spread out, not only limited to this book. And I find it very interesting that Rodchenko wrote here, this was a war of man with untamed nature. Man came and conquered and reconstructed himself. He arrived downcast, penalized and angry. I left with head held proudly high, a medal on his chest and a ticket to life. A life open to him in all the beauty and genuinely heroic creative labor. Well, of course, what I find quite interesting about this text is part of quite a long text, but in a lot of art historical studies that's taken quite literally, where I think you shouldn't really take this text in a literal way. I think it's very important to place that in its historical context. So I actually wanted to end my presentation with a line from another book from the 1930s, and that was the book The Foundation Pit by Andrei Platonov, in which he writes, "Man puts up a building and falls apart himself. Who will be left to live then?" Platonov finished this very critical book on Stalin's domestic policies already in the 1930s, so well before the whole project of Belomor that Rodchenko worked on started. And I find it very, the book is actually about a machine operator that starts to work on a foundation pit with the idea that he is creating this foundation pit for a house of the people and this very utopian future. But then as the work continues, realizes that the foundation pit is actually, won't be a utopian future, but it will be a mass grave. And I found this book very interesting in relation to USSR in construction, because of course USSR in construction constantly shows us that utopian, beautiful future that in reality never happened and also didn't take place. And I think it's very interesting with those images of USSR in construction to also see what they actually don't make us see, and also to look at the way of how they make us see that utopian future. Well, I think it's very important to not only then historically contextualize those images of USSR in construction, but then also reflect on the position of the artists who created them and the way they worked with ideology. Because if we speak about propaganda and power structures in those images, well, how exactly can we tell that they are there? And I think through a more word-image approach, you can do that actually quite easy. Because how did these artists then actually work with those ideas, and how did they position themselves opposite state dictates? And how is also the viewer made complicit within this creation of power structures? And I hope with this very small showing-seeing exercise, I underscored the importance of understanding those power structures that are so inherently present within the visual language of USSR and construction, and hopefully made that a little less deviant, because unfortunately you don't really see this approach not that often yet in art historical studies, and I think it's very important to really implement that as well. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michelle.
Maybe that
Can you sit down? Can you stay? Sorry.
It's okay. I think this is a question.
Yeah,
Michelle,
I thought we would have
thank you
questions
very
at
much.
the end.
Thank you very much. For me, it's super interesting because I participated in several exhibitions here in the Vanabbe about Lissitzky, and I remember that we had conversations about should we include USSR and Bau, this journal, in the exhibition, yes or no. And it was interesting because these conversations were never about diving more into the content behind the photographs. It was always about should we include this wrong part of the story in the exhibition. So thank you very much that you shed light on this part and make us help thinking about how to include it next time. Do we have questions? Is there someone who has questions? Jan, my colleague.
Thank you, Michelle, for a very interesting lecture and to look into depth in this photograph, in these photographs of Rodchenko. You started with some critiques, mainly by historians, on the display of these magazines, and the critique was mainly, well, how can you look at it aesthetically while there is such a blatant propaganda of forced labor. Now, what would be interesting to know for me is, do you have any advice of how to include this critique in an exhibition?
Thank you for your very good question. Of course, with this research is still mainly focused on how to point out the way that aesthetics and the content of the magazine itself are not opposite, but actually reinforce each other. And I didn't necessarily focus actually on how to show that within the museum itself. But I think with seeing, I think it's just interesting to make people realize on how they see what they see and not necessarily just what they see. And I think using that as a point of entry would be very helpful in addressing how the contents and the formal quality of the journal actually work together.
Would be a nice project.
I think it would be a very interesting continuation.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Question, Nick, you have a question?
Thanks so much, Michelle. The kind of the sort of violence of some of these images and histories that you so brilliantly but politely described was quite shocking in a way.
Yes.
I suppose I wanted to kind of, how did you, looking at some of these images over such a long period of time, how did you kind of, what was your relationship with the sort of aesthetics of this history of violence? Like what is it like to work with that material when you're presented with a history that is so violent?
Yeah, I actually find that quite difficult sometimes. So also, I never really full-time worked on this research. I just do it every now and then a little bit. But what actually really motivated me was when I started with this research in university, I was told that this was not the way to speak about the Russian avant-garde. And therefore I thought, well, then we should do that. Which was not really appreciated then by my teacher, but it did work out well. I think so. I think always when I looked at those images, I was always motivated by, I want to also show the power structures there and the story that's actually in them, and not just look how brilliantly this artist created a magazine. So that was always my strongest motivation for then working with this history, because I think it's also, well, maybe not very known here in the Netherlands, and yeah, that's also fine maybe. I think it could be better known, but yeah, and I think especially with those images, it's very important to point that out and show how we can actually learn from them as well.
Thank you. Other questions?
Maybe it's a suggestion, not really a question. Thank you so much. It's very interesting presentation, Michelle. I was also shocked to discover some images which used to be published in my motherland many years ago. I would suggest to put maybe for the future to come more attention to Mr. Lunacharsky, probably you know, who was a real mastermind and behind so many what you already showed, and not so many people know that, he was a kind of minister of propaganda, and all those beautiful images which you probably about to discover are possible and came to us thanks to him, because he was really a master, an artist and creative mind at that time. So pay more attention to his work, his biography, and the way how he was proceeding. Probably kind of, a suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have to go to the next speaker. So if there is any other questions, please keep them for this afternoon. Thank you very much, Michelle.